Good morning, everyone. My name is Eva Lievens, and I'm delighted to start off this conference with a panel that addresses a question, a very important question, that is being researched in both projects, both in MSOC and in SPION. We address the question whether we want or whether we need to protect or empower children and young people in the social media environment. The well-being of children and young people in the digital environment has been on top of the policy agenda since the mid-90s. Constantly there are developments. Only last week, the Vice President of the European Commission, Neelie Kroes, and the US Homeland Security Secretary, Janet Napolitano, signed a joint declaration in which they committed to work together to limit the risks and maximize the benefits for children on the internet. With regard to social media, recent research on both sides of the Atlantic has shown that children and young people are avid social media users. The EU Kids Online project, for instance, found that 38% of 9 to 12-year-olds has a social networking profile, and 77% of 13 to 16-year-olds are on social media. This environment presents a lot of exciting opportunities for them, for children, to share information, to interact with friends. But of course, there are also some risks, as is the case with any type of media. Privacy is, as we all know, one of the risks that is most often mentioned in this context. But in both of the projects, we are really convinced that in order to develop effective policies and effective regulatory initiatives, it is crucial to understand the practices of young media users on these social media. So it is the aim of this panel to combine evidence-based insights into young users' behavior and privacy with an analysis of the current and future legal framework in this domain, also extending this to self-regulatory initiatives that have been set up. You have experts from the US, as well as from Europe, and from different disciplines, as is very fitting within the concept of this conference. We have scholars from communication science, legal scholars from educational sciences, and they will present us with their research and their opinions about how to tackle this issue, and also try to make sure that the many misconceptions that still exist today when it comes to young people and social media and privacy are countered. So first, I'm delighted to pass the floor to Alice Marwick, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Communication and Media Studies at Fordham University in New York, where she teaches classes on social media and digital culture. And previously, she has been a postdoctoral researcher at Microsoft Research. So we're delighted that she's here, and the floor is yours, Alice.
Well, thank you, Eva, for that nice introduction. It's great to be here. It's a little intimidating to be the first speaker on the first panel, first thing in the morning. My name is Alice Marwick. I am an ethnographer. The project that I am talking about has to do with American teenagers specifically. And I work with Dana Boyd from Microsoft Research on a large-scale research project looking at American teenagers' views and attitudes towards social media and their practices therein. The method of this project is we have a corpus of about 165 90-minute interviews with teenagers across America, different states. We augment these with group discussions and other data collection methods, but our group of young people that we've surveyed is pretty broad. We have a fairly diverse population in terms of race, gender, sexuality, various indicators of socioeconomic status, political background, and school engagement level. And our last round of interviews was in the southeastern US, where we specifically asked young people about their privacy practices in social network sites, which is what I want to talk about today. We've published several papers on this topic, which I'm going to give you URLs to at the end of the presentation, on teen conceptions of privacy, on something we call teen drama, and on social steganography, which I'll talk about in this presentation. But right now we're working on formulating a theory of networked privacy. And so I'm going to go over some of the findings we've found in our other papers and also talk about this networked privacy concept. So when Dana and I started this project, the question we were trying to answer is, why don't young people care about privacy? And every time I tell people I study young people and privacy, this is the question I get asked. Well, people don't care about their privacy. Why is that? And when young people share content online in places like Facebook and Twitter, adults often look at it and say, you know, kids obviously don't care about privacy, because if they did, why would they be putting up all this personal information, these pictures, these anecdotes, these videos online for the whole world to see? But our research suggests that sharing information online does not indicate a lack of concern for privacy. And the first and most important thing is to separate these as two different dynamics. And other scholarly studies have borne this out. So there's a recent study by Chris Hufnagel and et al. At Berkeley, where they found very little difference between adult and teenage privacy attitudes online, as did a similar study by the Pew Internet Project. Privacy concerns do not tend to be related directly or indirectly to the amount of information that one shares online. People share information online for a variety of different reasons, whether that's to get support, to participate in peer groups, to get attention, but nobody posts information online with the unstated principle of decreasing their privacy or anything like that. Furthermore, participating in social media is a key part of teen life, and I think it even surprised us when we talked to young people just how integral Facebook was to their day-to-day interactions with their peers. Facebook allows teens an ability to socialize with each other even when they can't be together in person. It becomes a central repository for gossip, flirting, friendship building, and interaction. So one key difference between face-to-face interactions and Facebook interactions is that face-to-face, when you're chatting or talking with someone, the information that you're sharing with that person is intrinsically private. Yes, I can, audio tape the conversation I'm having with you and put it online later, or I can, write it up in an email and send it to people. But that takes effort, and it would also be seen as quite creepy. Online, when Facebook, content is public by default. It takes effort to make something private. And given this, how do you create privacy in a space that has the sort of intrinsic sense of publicness? So here's a quote from one of our informants. This is Alicia, who's a 17-year-old girl from North Carolina. And she says, "I've grown up with technology, so I don't know how it was before this boom of social networking. But it just seems like instead of spending all of our time talking to other individual people and sharing things that would seem private, we spend all of our time putting it in one module of communication where people can go and access it if they want to. So it's just more convenient. Adults never had that ability. I think privacy is more just you choosing what you want to keep to yourself. I don't think Facebook is violating privacy. I think it's letting people choose how they want to define privacy." Now, Alicia recognizes that how she and her friends approach privacy is quite different from those who grow up in an earlier era. But this is also rooted in the technological affordances of the medium that she's using to communicate with others, namely Facebook. Rather than seeing privacy as the default mode of interaction between her and her friends, Alicia sees privacy as a conscious choice. In her interactions online, she assumes that Facebook is public by default and that it takes effort to make things private. In other words, to Alicia, what Facebook enables is the ability for users to share information for others to consume when and as appropriate. So you go to Facebook and you choose what information you're going to consume, which would be understood in technological circles as pull, as opposed to having to directly target specific people or push. A public by default environment doesn't just reconfigure how privacy is managed, but the very nature and dynamic of sharing information with others. Now, when privacy scholars conceptualize privacy as having a public-private divide, or a divide between spatial configurations of home and work, for example, feminist scholars like Jeannie Suk have pointed out that this often ignores issues of abuse and domestic violence, where the home becomes a regulated and problematic space rather than a refuge. Now, on a smaller scale, the same issues affect teenagers, who are often subject to their parents' conceptualizations of privacy rather than their own. And for teens, the norms of information flow are often defined by the audience, by who's there, by who they're speaking to, particularly their parents. Teens frequently note that they have more privacy if their parents are not present. For example, 17-year-old Sam from Iowa said his private places are, quote, in a car or at a friend's house or something. I'm definitely not worried about it, and by it he means information sharing or chatting or talking, because they are not my parents, so I'm a little more open. Now here's a quote from Heather, who's a 16-year-old from Iowa, and she says, my home is not private because there are a lot of things that my mom does that make me feel like it's not private. I can be taking a shower and she'll come in, go to the bathroom, and leave. She has no respect for my personal privacy. I can be sitting on the computer talking to a friend and she'll be reading over my shoulder and I don't want her to. That's not really private to me. Private is kind of like a place where I can go and just be myself and not have to worry about anyone doing anything. And so when we asked Heather where she felt private, she said that it was in the back room of Panera Bread, which is a fast food chain restaurant where she worked. So for her, being at work, being in the back room, being able to listen to her music and talk to her friends was somewhere where she felt private because her parents weren't looking over her shoulder and they weren't interrupting her. So in our conversations about privacy, we found that teens believed that privacy had to do with their ability to control a social situation, how information flows, and when and where they can be observed by others. But teens often struggle to assert control over situations, particularly when technology usurps their control or when their agency is undermined. So for example, recently there was a fairly publicized anecdote in the US about a gay teenager who was a college student who had joined the gay chorus, which is sort of like a choir, a group of gay kids singing together. And his Facebook privacy settings were very locked down so that his parents couldn't see what he was doing on Facebook. But when he joined this group, the group's privacy settings were very open. So the fact that he had joined the queer chorus got bubbled up in the newsfeed and his parents both saw it, which created a lot of problems to him because he wasn't out to his father. So in that case, his agency to control the type of information that was being disseminated to his parents was undermined by the technology itself. More often than not, teens acknowledge this lack of control when the people over them, specifically their parents, it could also be teachers or coaches, insist on violating boundaries that teens create or social norms that they declare. Therein lies the key hypocrisy surrounding teens and privacy. Alongside adult complaints that teenagers don't care about online privacy is the persistent belief that teens do not have the right to privacy when it comes to their physical spaces or, in many cases, their online activities. Parents often use the fact that what teens do online is accessible as a justification for violating teen privacy. And the predominant discourse about young people and privacy also ignores the fact that there are benefits to sharing, that young people benefit from sharing information online in spaces like Facebook. This can be because it helps them build intimacy with their friends, they get support and closeness from information sharing. It can be because they want attention or validation. Perhaps they like putting their photographs online and getting feedback or becoming more visible. But it also allows them just more generally to participate in their peer group. Given this, there are a range of strategies that young people use to post content online and establish the boundaries of who can and can't see it. And so we've sort of divided this into two vague categories, two big buckets. And one of them are structural strategies, which is when young people are really using technical mechanisms or technical affordances to try to carve out private spaces for each other. So some of these are things that are built into the technologies that they use. So for example, Facebook filtering out certain people, blocking certain people, creating groups of friends and family and keeping those separate, which requires effort and can be clumsy, but we do meet young people who use these tools. We've also found that teens tend to use a multiplexity of communication options. Because they have so many communication options at their fingertips, they use different types of communication for different things. So they might post something on Facebook that was more generic because they know their parents are there, but they might use Twitter, like a private lockdown Twitter account where only their friends are following, to post really personal things. Often they use accounts that their parents don't know about. Nowadays we're seeing a lot of teens moving to Tumblr and Reddit because they can use pseudonyms on there and it's not as easy to track them, their parents to find out about them as it is on Facebook. Or we know lots of teens, and we've met plenty of adults who use different accounts, multiple accounts on Facebook, different nicknames, things that only their friends can find, things like that. But there's also a set of social strategies that teenagers employ. And the first one is what we call social steganography. And that's the idea that just because you can access content doesn't mean you can understand it. So anyone who's ever driven a car with two teenagers or middle school kids in the back chatting away about something, you can hear everything that they say, but you can't necessarily understand any of it. And that's because a lot of times online, teenagers are using inside jokes, or they're using a certain type of language or references to certain things to sort of indicate that content is or isn't appropriate for a certain audience. So what we find is that when we ask teenagers to go through their friends' Facebook statuses, they'll point to certain statuses and be like, oh, well, that's not meant for me because they're talking about summer camp. So that's something that she's writing for her camp friends, for example. So teens often can sort of know when something is or isn't designed for them to read. And this is really an example of teens attempting to achieve privacy in public by establishing social norms. So in general, social norms with regard to privacy are most often invoked by figures like Eric Schmidt or Mark Zuckerberg when they discuss how privacy norms are quote unquote evolving to conveniently fit Facebook or Google's business model. But their power as a regulatory force in privacy is rarely discussed as opposed to law, technical mechanisms, or market forces. We find that teenagers are especially wedded to social norms as the only regulatory force that they feel empowered to shape. Specifically, teens have a tacit understanding about who should or should not be present in their social spaces. So a lot of the time we'll have teenagers say, I don't know why my parents are on Facebook. Facebook isn't for them. Facebook is for me and my friends, things like that. So social norms are created around Facebook sharing so as to try to preserve some semblance of privacy. And teens know that privacy protection is dependent on the network. It's not necessarily about the piece of information being shared, but about the social norms with that group of people of whether that information should be shared further. And in this context, control becomes the power to determine the informational norms of a particular social context, including who is listening and what is being shared. And so I want to give two examples of different sort of social norm things that we've seen. So here's Abigail, a 16-year-old from North Carolina, and we asked, will your mother ever misunderstand something that you post on Facebook? And she says, oh yes. My friend Matt, he's really good at chemistry, and we were joking on the wall that he was going to secretly make a meth lab. So I explained it to my mom, and my mom is like, what are you talking about? Matt is making a meth lab. He's a really sciencey kid. He's the last person you would expect to do drugs or whatever. And I was like, oh, it's an inside joke, and I would explain it to her. But that's the kind of thing I would delete if it's an inside joke that I think other people wouldn't understand. It might make me look bad, then I would delete it. In this sense, she deletes content that she thinks her parents might misunderstand to fit her parents' informational norms, which are more conservative and they're not up on the inside joke. It's interesting in this quote that she specifically sits down with her mom and explains it to her because she doesn't want her mother to think that one of her friends is actually creating a crystal meth lab. This is another example from, in one of the classes that I teach, I ask students to violate a social norm on Facebook, and we talk a lot about what the social norms are, and they often teach me about social norms that I'm not aware of because they change all the time. And if you're a 19 or 20-year-old today, you might have thousands of photos on Facebook going back to your early teen years. So it's considered a very impolite to go back and comment on people's old pictures. Because, for example, if you comment on a dorky picture of someone when they're 14, it gets bubbled up in the news feed and all of a sudden everyone sees it all over again. So when I ask students to do this, to go back and comment on their friends' older pictures, they often got blocked, they got texted and asked to stop, they got defriended, all these sort of extreme reactions. In networked publics, privacy is not individual. It is not dependent on individual control over data or individual choices. Instead, privacy as it exists in social media is networked privacy. Networked privacy indicates that privacy can only be maintained through shared social norms over information sharing. Because other people can easily violate privacy, whether by cutting and pasting a status message and emailing it to a friend, or by tagging and implicating photograph, shared norms must exist to prevent this from happening. Conceptualizing privacy as networked also suggests that social contexts cannot be easily defined, as they are co-constructed by all the players present, as well as the technological affordances of the social technology in play. So most of our current frames about online privacy, not necessarily the frames in this room, but more public discourse frames, assume that each person can make decisions before sharing a piece of content that are based on an accurate understanding of who the information will be shared with and in what context. And as we've seen, this process can be quite challenging for teenagers. All right, I'm a little over time, but I just want to go over these big takeaways. So we find that teens are often most concerned not with the government or marketers or predators seeing their information, but they're most concerned about parents, teachers, and adults. We also find that teens have their privacy violated in many other ways, from security cameras and metal detectors in American schools to being forced to share their password with their parents. And finally, we know that teenagers want to participate in teen life, and currently that's on a medium that makes many areas of teen life more visible. It's not that the content has changed, the things that teenagers have talked about, it's just that now it's more visible, and that can be quite uncomfortable for those who see it who aren't used to seeing it. All right, well, thank you very much for having me speak, and I'm sorry that I went a little over time. Thanks.
No problem. Thank you very much, Alice. We will have ample time for questions after we heard from all of our panel members. So please, if you have questions for Alice, remember them or write them down, and we will get back to them in a short while. I will now give the floor to Tammy Schellens, who is a professor of educational technology at the Department of Educational Studies of Ghent University, who is one of the partners of the SPION project. So Tammy, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. For me, it's also very intimidating to be the first presenter, the first non-native presenter after the previous one, but I give it my best shot. I will be presenting the research based on the PhD work of Ellen van der Hove. And as was pointed out already by Eva, we all know that the use of social network sites increases, and that raises some concerns about privacy and security. We are all familiar with the headlines in the newspapers, such as students suspended for Facebook teacher slam, or with the media reporting on the so-called new dangerous trends on Facebook, like the sneaky hat trend. But what we are wondering is, are television, or the papers, or the media overreacting? But I think we cannot neglect the fact that there are indeed some dangers possible. And so based on the framework of the more, we think we can distinguish three main potential risks. So the first one are the content risks. So let's think about this is very small on my screen, the provocative content, for example, the hate groups. Sometimes we can see on Facebook wrong information, adapted pictures, wrong status updates. With regard to content risk, we think about cyberbullying. We think about sexual solicitations, such as explicit sexual pictures. And we think about, too many information on their profile. With regard to commercial risks, and I think that's the risks that are not so well known by the youngsters or by the teenagers. That's about, they are not always aware about target advertising, they are not always aware of social advertising, data sharing with third companies, and things like that. So, should we be worried or should we intervene? I think it all depends on whether or not the youngsters are aware of these facts and whether and how they really behave on the internet. Now, a lot of survey research has already been done, but the problem with survey research is that the answers are not always that reliable. As you can see in this slide, we have Amke who says, I think you're better not posing with stupid things like beer. That is not okay. For example, when your boss is checking your profile. But then the same Amke, who was warning about employees checking profiles, appears to have a profile picture on which he is posing with 2 beers. But then she says, but I'm still young, so it won't matter that much, she defends herself. So in a way, we think, survey research is maybe not always that reliable, and to overcome these problems, we opted for an observational study because we really wanted to have a clear picture of how safe do teens really behave on social network sites. So what did we do? We selected a representative sample of 1,050 Facebook profiles of Flemish youngsters between 13 and 18 years old. Half of the profiles were of boys, half of the profiles were of girls, and the average age was about 15 years. So what did we want to find out? First of all, we wanted to know what kind of information do teenagers really put on their profile, on their Facebook profile pages. Do teenagers use their privacy settings or adapt their privacy settings to secure this information? And does this information bring risk? And also we wanted to shed light on, okay, are there any differences regarding to age or gender? So, but due to some time constraints, I'm going to only focus on the second and the third research questions. So what about the privacy settings? We made the distinction between, okay, what you can see logged out, so what is public for everyone, and we also wanted to see what can you see as friends and as friends of friends. So with regard to what is public, we noticed that still a lot of information is visible. For more than half of the students, we could still find them in Google, we could still find them on Facebook, we could, in more than half of the cases, find their name, their surname, their profile pictures, even their interests. And in some of the cases, we could also see pictures and some of their wall posts. But what was especially interesting for us was also to see what's the difference between what a friend can see and what friends of friends can see. Because we were aware of the fact that sometimes teenagers think, okay, friends of friends, we know this. But in most of the cases, friends of friends are also strangers to them. So when we looked at the differences, we saw, okay, with regard to name, surname, profile pictures, and gender, nothing was protected, also not for friends of friends. But if you look at the other things, posted pictures, their interests, date of birth, wall post, information about their relationship status, posted video, and email address, we saw significant differences. So we could already say, okay, these teenagers really adapt to some extent their privacy accounts. But we should put this a little bit in perspective because you can see also friends of friends can still see a lot of information. So for us it was also important to know, okay, you can still see a lot of information, but is this about risky information? So we wanted to know, are there any signs in interests and pictures and wall posts of, for example, drug abuse, partying, sex, bad attitudes towards school, teacher, parents, hate messages, commercial messages. And also we wanted to see, can we see contact information? So the results. If you have a look at this slide, you see that there is some risky information visible. There is a difference between risky information visible for the friends and visible for friends of friends. But still, if we look at, okay, the tagged pictures with regard to partying, alcohol, nudity, you see that even for friends of friends, some information, some risky information is visible. The same for interest. You can see that almost 1/3 of this information, so negative attitude towards the superiors, negative attitude towards schools, and things like that, are also visible for friends of friends, which in a lot of cases are really strangers to them. The pictures with regard to contact information was a more promising picture. There we saw clear differences between what friends could see and what friends of friends could see. And it was also very clear that almost no one posted their address, their mobile phone number, and their website. So this was a much more nice picture. So there is Also with regard to age and to gender, we saw some differences. The older, the more risky information. Also, boys posted more alcohol-related messages and interests, and for girls, they post more pictures and videos of themselves, where you can see some nudity, kissing, or partying, and some more negative attitudes towards school and superiors and peers. So, conclusion, do teenagers use their privacy settings? Yes, they do, but to some extent. You can still see a lot of information. Does this information bring risks? With regard to contact information, we can say that this is pretty much okay. We thought about why should that be? Maybe because there are already a lot of campaigns warning people, okay, do not put your contact information. Also, the parents and the teachers warning the children to do this. But still, the profile page contains risky information. With regard to differences, with regard to age, the older, the more information on the page, but it's not better protected. And the older, also the more risky information. So we thought, okay, maybe people or students are only posting information, but never erasing information. And what could be the problem? Maybe there is no clear rise in awareness, or maybe they don't even know how to change it. And so differences with regard to gender, we can say that in general, girls post more risky information. So based on this observation study, we thought, okay, education is still needed and for all ages, but maybe with a different focus. So we thought, okay, we go for an intervention study and we see if we can have an impact, if we can influence this. But the question, of course, was how should we design such an educational intervention? So we opted for really an intervention in schools. Why? Because this is already emphasized by many authors as a good solution. The topic is normally formally included in many curriculums in many countries, but what we saw was that there is an inconsistent implementation. Also, we see that there are already a lot of existing educational packages, but there are some problems with it. Not a lot of these packages are really evaluated. Sometimes there is no theoretical base. Sometimes not all the categories of risks are tackled. Or sometimes these packages are really too broad and not really focused on social network sites, but mostly on the internet as a whole. So what did we do? We developed the material based on existing materials, materials from Child Focus, from InSafe, but we adapted it based on a needs analysis of the teachers. Because we say, okay, we know that these packages are not used, why are they not used? And the teachers say, okay, we want a short intervention, we want an intervention that's easy to implement, and we want something attractive. So what did we do? We tried to adapt these packages, and we also made sure that the three categories of risks that I pointed out before were really included. We also tried to put some instructional principles in the package, such as active learning, authentic learning, multiple perspective, and collaborative learning. That's always put forward as a good instructional strategy. So we had the material developed, we had a teacher manual, we had the student syllabus, and it was a 1-hour package. So the main objectives were to raise awareness and of course also to change this unsafe behavior. And we wanted to know, okay, does a short-term intervention in the form of one session about content, contact, or commercial risks has an impact on the awareness and on the behavior of teenagers? What did we do? We had an implementation study, we had a pre-test, post-test design, we had a control group, and we had the 3 conditions. What were the results? With regard to the different courses, we saw that they all reached their goal with regard to awareness. We even saw some cross-content effects. But with regard to behavior, the picture was less promising. We only saw some impact on content risk, so we still had a problem. And the impact on behavior was still limited. We thought about possible explanation. Maybe raising awareness is not enough to really go to the next step to really change behavior. Of course, a short-term intervention, which was really asked by the teachers, maybe that's not enough. Then we thought, okay, more research is needed to really find critical factors to change this behavior. So, through design-based research, we went to our second iteration. So we adapted our packages based on the previous results. And we thought, okay, how can we really change behavior? Again, we used the theory of planned behavior, but now we really focused on the subjective norm and more specific on the experience of social pressure. Why was that? Because we thought, okay, maybe teens don't change their behavior and attitudes due to social pressure of their peers in the class. Also, for example, due to, because posting information is image related, it's some kind of identity shaping when they put information on their Facebook, so that could be the problem. So we thought, okay, although normally collaborative learning is a very good instructional strategy, maybe in this case it could be counterproductive. So what did we do? We decreased all the collaborative learning in the materials, and we raised the opportunities, or we increased the opportunities for individual reflection. So we had a new intervention, again with more than 1,000 students, and again we had the same pre-test, post-test design, but this time we really saw that there was a clear impact on awareness, so on knowledge, on the attitudes, and even on the behavior. But of course, we should put this a little bit in perspective. There's still room for a lot of improvement because there were significant differences, but the effect sizes were not that big. So we are now already thinking about further iterations, and what we are planning to do is, okay, we focus also a little bit more on this subjective norm. So this means we also will put, okay, here it is, will include the parents. So the subjective norm is about asking meaningful others, or include meaningful others in the package. So in this case, we will try to work with the parents, and we will also focus on the perceived behavior control. So we will have a look at maybe the students don't really have the technical skills. So the further research will be, okay, parental involvement. So we will compare homework assignment alone, homework assignment with parents, and just a parent information session, and we will also focus on technical skills. But the conclusion so far, I think, is educating youngsters about the risks of social network size in the schools can be very useful, but we still need some more evaluation research to come to good packages. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tammy. We will now hear from Simona van der Hoff, who is a professor of law and information society at Leiden University in the Netherlands. She's also a member of the Dutch EU Kids Online team, and also the project leader of a project titled Empowering and Protecting Children and Adolescents Against Cyberbullying.
Okay, thank you very much, Eva. Let's see if it's, yeah. Well, it's an honor to be here at this conference, and I'm going to talk to you about the general data protection regulation, or rather the proposal that is out there since this year, and focus on some of the issues that regulate children's online data protection. I have to start my presentation first. Yeah, that's it. Well, first an overview of what I'm going to do. After a short introduction, I'm going to focus basically on 4 issues, being consent, deleting personal data, profiling, and transparency. But first a short introduction. So in the regulation, other than in the directive that's now in place and has been implemented in all of the member states, in the regulation there will be special provisions for children protecting their online personal data. We'll look in this into those provisions in a minute. And I think it's very important that we regulate personal data protection for children. There's been a lot of studies over the last couple of years. EU Kids Online has been mentioned already. And we know that kids can be vulnerable on the internet, and we also know that disclosing personal data can augment that vulnerability. For instance, we know that there may be a direct relation between disclosing personal data, showing yourself as a certain person on the internet, particularly showing yourself as a vulnerable person on the internet and being prone to victimization of grooming, lover boys. But also there is a relation between disclosing personal data and being a victim of cyberbullying. So it's important that we have rules on personal data protection. The regulation follows the UN Child Rights Convention by having a definition of a child being a person under the age of 18, which I also think is a very good thing, because the definition of what a child is can be very different from legal system to legal system, but also within legal systems we have different definitions. So there is clarity there, which I think is important. Something which is unfortunate is that there is what we call a household exception in the regulation, meaning that personal data protection that is provided under the regulation to children will only be relevant to commercial settings and not in private settings, which would be issues of cyberbullying I just mentioned, because that would be something between peers and not something between a kid and a commercial company. So this is rather unfortunate. So let's have a look at some of the issues that will be regulated in the regulation. I'm just going to throw it down. Be a bit messy here. So first let's have a look at consent. What the regulation does, and it's a bit similar to COPPA in the United States, is that for children under the age of 13 there has to be verifiable parental consent. Children above the age of 13 can consent to processing of their personal data themselves. Well, there are some issues with this provision, and also more generally. The regulation does imply that there is a difference between consent given by an adult and consent given by a child. In this case, a child above the age of 13, because under the age of 13 they can't consent themselves. So they imply that there is a difference, and this has something to do with the fact that children aren't aware as well of the risks on the internet as adults. But how this will play out under the regulation and what the criteria are for this difference is not yet clear. So there is some legal uncertainty there. Another issue with this provision is that it's not really clear what verifiable consent is under the provision. We do know in broad lines that it is about verifying the age of the person, so knowing whether you're dealing with someone that is older than 13 or younger, and if the person is younger than 13, whether you're dealing with a parent that has been consenting to the personal data processing. But how are you going to verify that age? Can you use very simple mechanisms like being used now very often, that you just ask for a birth date, or do you need more advanced mechanisms to verify that age? So what is verifiability? Another issue is who has to determine verifiable consent? Is it that child-specific sites have to do that, or also other sites that are, more directed at a general audience, but where also children may be visitors or users? And do these sites then have to have actual knowledge of kids using their site in a specific situation? So there are all kinds of issues there that we don't know how they will play out under the regulation. And it's very important, I think, for businesses to have legal certainty here, because I think it can have a very big impact on their big business processes and be very costly if they, because they have to be implementing all kinds of mechanisms and they have to know what. Well, then there are all kinds of issues with age verification technologies. How advanced should the methods be that we're going to use, that they have to use? I already mentioned that. We know that there aren't any very advanced methods yet, well, at least not in a cross-border settings that you. A cross-border setting that you could use, and as we know, the internet is international, so it should be something that could be used in a cross-border setting, but they're not available yet. The European Commission will probably set certain specifications. They can do that under the regulation. They can do that in what is called delegated acts. But then the specification shouldn't be too strict, because they could stifle innovation and prevent all kinds of very good new solutions from developing. Another issue with these technologies can be that they very paradoxically could lead to a lot more personal data processing, whereas that's something that we would want to restrict under the regulation, especially with respect to children. But if you have to verify who a person is, how old that person is, whether that person is a parent or not, that could lead to a lot more personal data processing. And a final issue that I would like to mention with respect to these technologies is that perhaps we don't want these technologies to turn into sort of parental control technologies, which they could become, because you want parents to a certain extent monitor what kids are doing, but you also want kids to have a certain kind of freedom to roam the internet and do the things they want to do there. A good thing here is, I think, that for children above the age of 13, they can still consent themselves, so they have this freedom to use the internet without their parents looking over their shoulder. Well, they may still be looking over their shoulders, but they don't have to consent to what they're doing there. And you may want to protect younger children a bit more, children under the age of 13, but still, if you have to use these technologies, it may be a bit much when it comes to surveillance. So, the second issue I wanted to address is deleting personal data, also known as the right to be forgotten, which is a right to delete information, personal information from the internet when you no longer want your data to be processed and the companies don't have a legitimate reason to keep that data. And attached to that, there is an obligation for those companies to inform third parties about the deletion request, so they also know that this data has to be deleted if it has been shared with those third parties. Well, again, there are all kinds of issues here that are not clear yet. For instance, a lot of these social networking sites where you would maybe want to delete some personal data are often connected with other social networking sites. So Facebook is connected to LinkedIn and maybe connected to Twitter, and they can automatically be sharing data. There are all kinds of apps connected to Facebook. For instance, Instagram, which is now part of Facebook. Which seamlessly allows you to share photos between Instagram and Facebook. So all these networks, all these sites and all these apps are connected, and how are you going to really delete that information from all these venues? So you maybe want to automate that process, but can you do that? Because on the other end we have freedom of information, and particularly in relation to the press, that could bring about, even if it's practically possible, that could bring on all kinds of issues there. Well, there's been a lot written about the right to be forgotten being not at all effective because of the nature of the internet. The internet has an iron memory. When something is out there, it's very hard to get it back, to get it deleted, especially when it's been out there for some time already. So perhaps we should focus more on prevention and also having young people use adequate privacy settings to make sure that not all kinds of embarrassing information is online or is not shared very broadly. And I think what Alice mentioned before, social norms developing there are very, very important and should be taken into account. Well, final issue here is that I think the household exception, I've already mentioned it, is also limiting the success of the right to be forgotten, because a lot of the information that you may want to delete will probably be shared in private settings and not not in a commercial setting, and the right doesn't apply there. And there's also the question, what is a household setting? Because if you have a lot of friends on Facebook, you could ask yourself the question if that's still a private setting, or if it turns into a public setting, and whether maybe the exemption wouldn't apply anymore in that situation. But we don't know. So another important issue, I think, is profiling, with online tracking and tracing people having become the norm really on the internet. And that's really a new provision in the regulation that prohibits profiling unless you have consent. So profiling by setting cookies, for instance, on your computer, and then tracking and tracing everything you do, for instance, for behavioral advertising. So this is prohibited unless you have consented to profiling, or unless it's part of a contractual relationship. So if you're putting stuff into your shopping basket at Amazon.com, they can track you, because otherwise the system wouldn't work. So there are some exceptions, but otherwise it's prohibited. And it's not at all clear under the regulation how children, what is the position of children here, because in one of the considerations of the regulation it says that profiling shouldn't concern a child. So does the exemption that we have for this prohibition also apply to children or not? I would say, if I read the consideration, it doesn't apply there. So for children, profiling would be prohibited. But when you look at the provisions of the regulation, you will find nothing about the topic. So it's really unclear. Another issue, if it would be prohibited with respect to children, we would again have the issue of age verification. How do you know that you're dealing with children? How do you know that you're tracking and tracing children on a website? You may know that when it's a child-specific site, but it may be more difficult when it's a general audience site. So it's for instance on Facebook. So all kinds of issues there as well. Well, also particularly important but also difficult topic is transparency, which is very difficult to achieve with respect to adults, let alone children. And the regulation tells us that privacy policies should be clear and should be understandable for children. So probably it means that the language should be very simple, that they maybe should use examples, pictures, pop-ups, and all kinds of things. But even very simple and very clear privacy statements can still be very non-transparent because of the complex data processing practices that are behind certain websites. Again, looking at Facebook, if you read the privacy statement, it's very well readable. You know, it's not difficult language, but it's still very difficult to understand what is actually going on behind the scenes. Especially also because privacy statements are changed all the time, so it's very difficult to keep up. And how are we going to do that with respect to children if it's already very difficult for adults? And it's very difficult because actually, you know, the thing about the social networking sites is that, and it's already been mentioned before, that the thing that they do, they have a commercial interest to seduce you to disclose personal data. And even if you have very strict privacy settings, you can still leak personal data. I've got some examples in my own environment, and people just don't notice all that often. The concept, the principle of privacy by design that will be in the regulation will be very important here. So building in privacy values within the technical system. But I think we still don't, you know, understand enough of what privacy by design really is and how we're going to implement it. So that still needs a lot of work to better understand what it is. Okay, wrapping up. I think the regulation is an improvement to the directive because we will have some provisions that will protect children. It can also be an important basis for self-regulation because absent any regulation in this field at the moment, all of it is now left basically to self-regulation. And it's a bit ironic, I think, that one of the initiatives that we have in the field of self-regulation, which is the CEO coalition in Europe, where Facebook is the company leading the action on privacy and personal data protection for children. So I'm a bit skeptical about that. So I think it's important to have a legal basis for self-regulation to steer that development, because on the other hand, we do want those companies to be involved. We want their commitment, we want their expertise, and they're also the ones that can implement solutions for us. So they are important, but we also should be very much aware that the interests that are out there are clashing, because on the one hand we have the commercial interest of the companies that want to share our personal data, that want to commercialize our profiles, and on the other hand we have the interest of children, where we do not necessarily want that their personal profiles are used as commercial commodities, and that maybe you may want to protect against personal data abuse and things like that. So a final remark, it's an improvement, but there are still a lot of questions, and I hope I've shown you some of them that are unanswered by the regulation, so there is still a lot of work to do in this field. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simona. I would now like to pass the floor to Elena Costa, our discussant, a former colleague of mine and currently an assistant professor of technology regulation at TILT, the Tilburg Institute for Law, Technology and Society at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. Please, Eleni, can you share your first impressions after the 3 very interesting presentations that we have heard?
Thank you, Eva. It's my pleasure to be here. It's strange to be here as a guest, but it was really exciting for me to be part of this panel. I must say that I was impressed by all 3 presentations, and all 3 presented different angles of the same topic, so I think they gave a very complete view of what we want to discuss with you in the next half an hour or so. First of all, I would like to thank Alice for presenting us the results of her study and giving us very clear examples. I think it's always very helpful for the audience when we hear quotes from the people that participate in the study, and it helps us understand that it may be that we are approaching the thing from, by the thing I mean the notion of privacy, from maybe from a perspective that should be changed. So we have an understanding of privacy and we expect teenagers to react in the same way. But what your research showed and what your study shows is that it's not that teenagers are not interested about privacy, it's just they understand it in a different way maybe. So this is something that we should focus on, and further research is definitely needed. I really liked the example of the statement from the 17-year-old Alicia that talked about convenience, and this is actually something that we should take into account. If the average teenager posts as many statements on Facebook and on social networks as we suspect, then it would be practically impossible for them to modify the privacy settings of each one of the statements. So we need to see how that would work. Another thing that I think was, that I feel that was a common finding from both studies, the one of Alice and the one of Tammy, is the role of parents. So in your study, I think you managed to show that teenagers feel that they don't have privacy, especially as far as their parents and maybe even their teachers are concerned. So this is something that we should definitely take into account, and we should see how technology can help teenagers into controlling their data, but maybe in a way that they want to have them control and not how we understand control. So I found that very interesting and intriguing. And I feel that Tammy's presentation was also very closely related. There was a different starting point. So the study focused mainly on the privacy settings. So the researchers had identified 3 types of risks. So I just remind you that we talked about content, contact, and commercial risks. And the privacy settings, actually, they can be classified in 3 big categories. The postings and information in general that is open to the general public. The one that is visible to friends, and the last category would be visible to friends of friends. A lot of information is public, but in general we can see that teenagers restrict information from the general public. However, there is not much differentiation between what they reveal to their friends and to their friends of friends. And this is probably something that we should look closer into. I know that also this is an issue that has attracted quite a lot of attention from technical people who are trying to work on this. I think Seda has done a lot of work on this as well. What I found extremely interesting in the presentation of Tami is that instead of just stopping at the point of doing the research, you actually moved on how education and schools can help into that, and that was very interesting to hear the way how you approached it. The results showed that just raising awareness for teenagers is not enough, but we reached the same conclusion that parents need to be involved, and that's in line with what Alice already said. Moving to the third presentation, I was personally, because of my background, very interested to hear the presentation of Simona, because we are in the middle of the change of the regulatory framework on data protection in Europe at this moment. We have had the Data Protection Directive since 1995, so it's really long time. And now, like the beginning of 2012, there was a draft data protection regulation proposed by the European Commission, which is now under discussion at European level, but this is the moment when individuals, policy organizations, etc., can raise their voice and say, this is wrong, this is what should be included, and this is the way how we should go forward. So it was very interesting to see Simona talking about a new article that talks about the protection of personal data of children. And by children, we understand individuals below the age of 18. However, the regulation makes a very clear classification of children below the age of 13 and above the age of 13. So the issues, how do we verify that somebody is below or above 13 years, that's very, very interesting, and I think it will require a lot of collaboration between people from different disciplines. This is not a legal issue, it's definitely an issue that will attract a lot of attention from technology and people working on that. It was very interesting to hear that this is not just a standalone article, so Article 8 is not the only one that should be in the focus of our research with regard to children, but there are a lot of aspects with regard to the protection of children, touching upon the right to be forgotten, how can this be implemented, automated profiling, privacy by design. As I personally think that it is very difficult, a very difficult topic that you talked about is the household exemption and how is this to be understood. I think it's very difficult for the audience to understand it and to grasp what we mean by that. So I think a lot of research has to be done and we need to approach the larger audience to understand the scope of application of the directive. One thing that maybe I would like to mention, and maybe we can start our discussion from that, is that the age of 13 is the age that was already mentioned in the US legislation relating to children. However, if we look into the national legislation about the protection of children in Europe, in many European countries, we will see that the respective age would be 12, 14, 15, or 16. So the age of 13 is practically not a common standard in Europe, in almost none of the member states at this moment. So I can say that we see a tendency of Europe to adjust to the US standards, or maybe it's wrong, it's my feeling. And I think that many people also have the impression that this is happening because Facebook has as age when children can consent on their own, the age of 13, but actually Facebook has that because it's in the US legislation. But I think it's interesting to see that Europe is trying to make a step towards the US, but just an impression of how you see the future for that. Thank you.
Simona, you want to react? Yes.
Yeah, one quick remark, because if I understand the COPPA, which is the US law on online privacy protection for children, and there are some amendments to that act to broaden its scope, really. And I'm not sure. I'm looking at you too. I think they're actually it's their intention to raise the age to the age of 18. For privacy protection under COPPA. So there would be a difference then with the regulation. We're trying to bring it up to one level now. But if they're going to change that, you will see that there will be differences which wouldn't be too effective in an online world, I think.
Well, I can talk a little bit about the way that COPPA has actually played out in the United States. And so that the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act says that sites can't gather information from children younger than 13. And the way that this is played out is that virtually every social site in the United States, from Gmail to Skype to Facebook, prevents children under 13 from using the service. And the age verification is basically like you input your birth date. So obviously this is quite easy to fake. And what we found is that when we talk to parents about COPPA, we find that parents generally do not know that this law has anything to do with data protection or data collection. Instead, most parents think it is a sign of maturity, that your children are mature enough to use Facebook once they turn 13, the magic age. And so what we found is this means that a lot of parents will circumvent COPPA for their children by helping them create accounts, teaching them to falsify their birth date, or saying, we want to use Skype to talk to your grandparents, so we need to create an account for you, but you're mature enough. They think that if their child is mature enough to use Facebook, then it's totally fine. And so, of course, what we find is that a large number of young people, 11 and 12-year-olds, are on Facebook or on similar sites, sometimes with very specific parental understanding that they're doing this for a reason. And so I think that I'm not 100%, to be honest, familiar with the current amendments, the proposed amendments to COPPA, but generally I don't think that COPPA has been particularly successful in creating a sort of hard, bright line along the age of 13. It certainly hasn't been successful in explaining to parents or teachers or other adults why this regulation has been put in place. And I know that there is a large amount of the lobbying that's going on for COPPA is done by age verification technology providers. So it, also not very surprisingly. So I don't necessarily think that this law should be used as a model for anything that Europe does per se, but it'll be interesting to see how these new proposed regulations do play out in the next year or so.
But I also want to react on this because I'm not sure that the age should be raised, because when we look at our research, we see, okay, younger children, they put different information on internet. They are playing games, they are looking at sports, they talk about games, teams, athletes, things like that. And what we noticed was the older the teenagers became, the more risky their information became. So I think for me, it would be a better solution to start the education from an earlier age on, and to learn the children, to empower the children how to work with Facebook. Because now, at the age of 13, we did not notice any particularly risky information, or the information was just different. It was, for me, I don't think the problem is, okay, younger children are on Facebook. No, younger children can be on Facebook, but they should have, they should be educated and empowered to use Facebook.
Yeah, maybe in reaction to that, because I do agree with that. But I think there are separate issues. One is doing things that are risky online, and it's certainly true that older children are more prone to risk there than younger children. But another issue is, and that's when you look at the issue of profiling, and also, I'm also not an expert on US legislation, but we have there is a bill for do not track and things like that. And that's more focused on targeted advertising, and the idea that children should be somehow, should be free online to do whatever they want to do, to play, to socialize, and not be tracked like they're being a commercial commodity or something. And all these, these strategies to track children are becoming much more sophisticated. They're on game sites, especially the younger children. They're looking like game sites, but at the same time they're tracked. Companies want to find out their preferences, and there are all kinds of strategies to do that. And then they want to, the children to nag to their parents, to buy all kinds of things. So there is certainly an issue, more a moral issue, you could say, where we perhaps don't want children to be subjected to these kinds of practices, and that's also where this legislation comes in, I think. But I'm certainly also, I agree with you that maybe we should look very carefully at what COPPA does and whether it has worked to see what we're going to do here in Europe, because there is a lot of experience also already in the US, and we know some of these things didn't work out very well. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the U.S. just has far fewer protections for children on advertising of all kinds, whether it's television advertising or advertising in schools, for example, is legal and totally common in the United States. So, I think that we're looking at two very different paradigms of how children are exposed to advertising in general. And so I think that those differences have to be taken into account when using U.S. policy, which I would not necessarily say is the best around data protection as any sort of model. Yeah.
Yeah, I think just to go a little bit further on this, the reason for including this 13 years in the legislation on advertising and commercial data of children has also led to arguments, for instance, in the framework of the EU Kids Online study. As a result, the result has been that Facebook has adopted this age of 13. But if you would have, if we would remove this age of 13, the companies, the providers, would be able to better protect children and take better measures to target them with appropriate information, clear and understandable information. And this leads me to something that Simona briefly touched upon, and which I want to get your opinions, is this issue of self-regulation. In Europe, currently, there are a lot of self-regulatory initiatives that are endorsed by the European Commission, such as the Safer Social Networking Principles, to which a lot of social media providers have subjected themselves. But the evaluations of these initiatives, there have been independent evaluations of these initiatives, have shown that the companies, the results of their efforts and of the implementation of certain measures they took is really quite limited. So they promise to do a lot, but actually they do not fulfill these promises. Also within the framework of the CEO coalition, to which Simona referred, it's very unclear how this is working, what is being discussed by these companies, often in private sessions. To some sessions, NGOs and interest groups are invited, but to others, they are completely closed. It's very untransparent. We don't know what the results is. As Simona pointed out, Facebook is in charge of the working group on privacy settings. So I just want to get your opinions on which role industry can and should play, and to what extent, if it appears that their initiatives are not effective, there should be some regulatory intervention. Simona, you want to start?
Yeah, it's a very difficult issue, because I think you need the industry to do something. But I don't trust them too much either. So, I think, and at the same time, when I look at the legislation that's been proposed now, there are still a lot of issues with that legislation, and I'm not sure if this is going to work really. So, yeah, I do think I don't think self-regulation as such is the right avenue. So we shouldn't leave it to companies like that, because talking about that CEO coalition, and it's true that it's very non-transparent what's happening. So the things that I know about it, I've read somewhere else, other people talking about it. So I'm not sure if it's true, but what I understood from Facebook leading this action on privacy and data protection is that they focus on what is happening between peers. They don't focus on what they are doing themselves, you know. So it's about privacy in private settings, and not about, you know, the things that happen for a commercial purpose. So you can see that there is sort of a bias already there, and that's not what we want, because we also want them to deal with what they're doing on the internet and their personal data practices. And I think the only way that you can make sure that something like that will be effective if there is strong policy and perhaps also regulatory action behind that. So I think you have to force them more to make those environments safer for children, because otherwise, you know, commercial interests will always be on top, I think. And they will always be in some way. Although I know a lot of these social networking sites, like also Habbo Hotel, they're doing a lot, you know, when it comes to child safety. So they're not all bad, but to really change things, I don't think it will work like this if you just leave it to voluntary self-regulation.
Okay, maybe Alice, can you share some insights about this in the US? Is this also something that is happening?
I think it's difficult because generally a lot of US laws on technology are formulated with good intentions, but they often are formulated by legislatures who don't have a wonderful understanding of the way the technology works. So sometimes they have unforeseen consequences. In general, we do not have a great track record of a lot of the legal regulation of the internet in the United States. It tends to be often prompted by moral panics or scares around certain things, whether that's online predators or cyber porn or any of the other things that have prompted sort of very, you know, quick responses to difficult issues that are then often struck down by the Supreme Court for violating speech laws. In general, though, I would have to agree, I don't think that there's a huge motive from industry to decrease the amount of data that they're collecting, since that is their business model after all. But I do think there's a lot of very well-intentioned people at a lot of these social sites. So I would agree, I don't think that they're quote-unquote all bad. And I think that a lot of the sites that are focused to children, like Club Penguin in the US and other similar things, a lot of the people who work on those sites, who have enormous vested interest in protecting children and children's best interests, also find themselves hampered by a lot of the laws around US children's, because if they around data collection from children, because if they're witnessing something where they feel like a child is maybe being abused in the home or is having some difficulties, they can't get any data about that child to protect that child from what's going on in their day-to-day life either. So I think it's very complicated. I don't think, you know, as with almost all issues around privacy, it's very difficult to come up with a one-size-fits-all solution. I think it's very contextual. I think it's based on, you know, the site, the people using the site, how they're using the site. But again, that makes it very difficult to legislate laws, which is why I think it has been so difficult to pass any kind of comprehensive data protection laws in the United States.
Thank you. Just before opening the floor, there's still one issue I would like the opinions of our panel members. Research shows that the age at which children start to use social media is decreasing, so they're starting younger and younger. And I'm just wondering whether you are aware of any research that is being done with regard to these very young users. Tammy or Alice?
What do you mean by very young?
I mean under the age of 12, like starting at 8, 9, 10.
No, our research started at the age of 13, so we did not include any younger children in our research. So, and I'm not even aware of existing research.
EU Kids Online, I think they're the age that the starting age for their surveys was, I think, 9 years old.
Oh, 9 years old,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah. But they're even much younger children, you know, using the internet. So we may have to drop even further.
But I'm not sure. But isn't that about using the internet? Is it really about social network sites?
Yeah. You're talking about EU Kids Online. Yeah, that's about social networking sites, and it's basically about online risks for children, online risks and opportunities, I should say.
On social network sites.
Yeah.
We only work with high school age kids or above. So the youngest kids we have are 13, and we only have a handful of those. For the most part, our research is on 14 to 19-year-olds, and that's partly because it's more difficult to get approval to do research
Yes,
on younger
that's
kids.
the same,
So
yeah.
so that's so
That's the same reason.
Exactly, yeah. So
Because in a way they're not allowed to be on Facebook,
Yeah.
and then you ask them, you go to schools, you want to talk about these things with the children, or you want to conduct a survey. Schools will never agree with that, and even parents won't. So
But
that's a bit the problem.
the sort of irony here, though, is that in the U.S. at least, private companies can conduct any kind of research they want on young children. So we know that places like Nike do focus groups on elementary school kids. We know that a lot of these companies do talk to kids and survey them and chat with them. But as academics, our hands are a little more tied, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately. I would like to invite questions from the public. There are microphones that go around normally. Yes. Please, before posing a question, identify yourselves if you want.
Data privacy.
Yes. And can you also please indicate to whom you're addressing your question? Anyone wants to kick off? Yes, Bettina?
Hi, I'm Bettina Behrendt, Professor of Computer Science at KU Leuven, and I'm in SPION as well, so you'll hear more about me tomorrow. But I have a question at this point. Talking about people younger than yourself is kind of a double-edged sword. It has the advantage that you are allowed to feel more protective and do stuff about it, and I'm also talking legally here, but it also has the temptation to feel superior. And we had some illusions, and I'm really addressing this to everyone here, we know about privacy and we have different privacy behavior than youngsters, children, whatever you might call them. I would really like to know from all of you, what do you think we can and should learn from what you're doing about people younger than yourself?
Okay, well, thank you for that really great question. I think that most of our research is prompted by exactly that. Rather than trying to come up with a paternalistic attitude as privacy researchers, like, we know all about privacy, we protect our privacy perfectly, which, by the way, I'm sure most people in this room don't, 100%. I also worry that a lot of the time we're studying young people in a vacuum without comparing their privacy practices to people older than them, and we expect younger people to somehow have like a more solid understanding of their privacy and data and dissemination online than their parents do. Like, we've interviewed plenty of young people that when we look at their parents' profile, their parents are sharing all kinds of personal information. We interviewed one young girl who she showed me her mother's profile, and her mother was wearing a bikini in her profile picture. So in that case, why are we putting the onus of responsibility on the young people to be sharing certain types of things where we don't necessarily put that same type of burden on adults? And I think what we've really been trying to do with our research is show that just because young people aren't behaving in the way that we would like them to in an ideal world doesn't mean that they don't care about privacy, and it doesn't mean that they don't have their own concerns, which weigh larger in their mind a lot of the time than the ones that we might impose upon them. So for example, for a young person, even if we tell them, like, there are these vague possible risks, which we can't necessarily define as like an absolute thing, versus hanging out with your friends and participating in public life. Like, which one are they going to choose? Which one would you choose if you were a 15-year-old? You know, I think it's really about giving kids the benefit of the doubt, that they're smart agents, they're allowed, they can make a lot of their own choices, and trying not to quite be so paternalistic, but also balancing that with risk factors. That's a very tricky and difficult balance, and I think probably everyone who does research in this area struggles with that to a certain extent.
Yeah, maybe I can say something about that too, because like for us it was very important to raise the awareness, to raise the knowledge, and to a certain extent also the behavior. But first of all, we said it's important that they at least know about these things, and maybe it's not to us to say, okay, you should change it, you should, but then at least when they know, they can make a right decision. But now we have the feeling that sometimes they don't know about these commercial risks, they are not aware of these things, they do not think about, okay, maybe maybe when I post a picture, maybe in the near future, my employee can see that. So we just want to raise this awareness, but then the choice can be with the youngsters, with the children. I'm not one who will say, okay, you will have to protect everything, but it has to be their own, they have to make a balanced choice at least. That's my opinion.
I also think that right now at the moment, because we are in the middle of this process of reviewing the regulation, both here in Europe as well as in the US, where the extension of COPPA is considered, that it's really so important to have these evidence-based insights, to have this social science research, to find out what people really think, what young people really think about privacy and how they behave. Because if, like Alice mentioned, if there is really a very strong social norm, for instance, not to go back in time and not to comment on the pictures of your friends when they were 5 years younger, maybe we don't even need a right to be forgotten. But we can only decide upon these things, I think, if we have this really strong evidence base. But unfortunately, there's not very much time left before there will be decisions made about the new regulation. But Simona, you wanted to say?
Just to add, I think we can actually learn a lot from those young people, and that's what I'm doing through research like yours, because they've got all these strategies, and I'm particularly interested in the norms that are developing, the social norms that are developing between them. And maybe when they become people going to work, when they become employers, they will deal very differently with embarrassing information that is out on the internet, because they have, their norms will have to. We look at that, like we are now. I'm working for a university. It would be terrible if something embarrassing would be out there about me when I was still a teenager, because you all do, embarrassing things then. That's the way I look at it now, but maybe people in 20 years' time will look very differently at those issues, because, they have to deal with that, because they know some embarrassing information may be out there, and they have developed norms to deal with that. So I'm very much interested in what they come up with themselves, actually.
Other questions? Claudia?
This is Claudia Diaz from KU Leuven. Yeah, I have a question more for Simone or more Eleni or Eva, the people who are more in law. The question is, so there is this difference in protection for children under 13. There are different rules. I was wondering if these different rules also apply to access by law enforcement to the information by under 18s or under 13s. If there are rules different there, and in two senses. So one is in the course of action investigations, that we know that social network data is often used for finding information about lawsuits or whatever. And the other, which is I think more scary even, is to use profiles to, for example, detect antisocial behavior or people who have behaviors that might lead to criminal behaviors in the future, particularly with youngsters engaging in some activities like vandalism or drug consumption, perhaps more than other age groups.
Yeah, this is a bit of a tricky question, because I think they're still discussing whether law enforcement issues will be part of the regulation, or whether there will be separate legislation for that. So I don't know really, actually. There will probably be exceptions in that field, because there is an exception under the current directive for these kinds of issues, or there can be exceptions under the directive for these kinds of issues, and I think also under regulation. But it can also be that this will be taken out of the regulation, and there will be different legislation in the field, because there is a very strong interest from law enforcement to get their hands on all kinds of information that is on the internet, and particularly also social networking sites. So I don't know for the moment what will happen under the regulation, to be honest.
Indeed, but I must say that experience shows that
Yeah,
they will try to get as much as possible.
Yeah, that's what I meant by the strong interest, yeah.
But we are waiting and seeing, because at this moment we have the draft regulation and there is also a draft directive for processing of personal data by police and judicial authorities, but that's also under review. So we are really in a phase where the legal framework is changing, and we can push and influence. I mean, this is why we are here, to identify such issues. So if you consider this very important, you should definitely try to find a way to get your way to the legislators. Yeah. At this moment, they are off. From the regulation, they are off.
Okay, other questions? Yes?
Hi, I'm Maria from Privacy International. I'd like to refer to the conceptualization of privacy that you mentioned earlier. But I think that privacy today, especially for teenagers, is more about control, because as you mentioned, they believe that they share what they choose to share, so it's really about them controlling their data rather than secrecy. But I think that this control, in many respects, is illusionary, in the sense that every online activity just leave an online trace, and everything you do can be tracked. Now, taking this into consideration, and the European Data Protection Directive, which is currently being reviewed, there are many communications laws all over the world which legally allow the interception of communications, such as Facebook, Skype, emails, etc., etc. So how exactly can we protect teenagers, youth in general, from their data being misused when it is legally allowed to intercept the data in most of the countries of the world? Even in Europe, like right now as we speak, in the UK, they're trying to pass a communications bill which will legalize interception of email, Facebook, etc. How can we practically protect them when the distribution of communications has been legalized? And more than that, how can we also protect them? How can the right to be forgotten have any sense whatsoever when we have a European data retention directive? When data can be retained, when data can be intercepted? How can we protect the youth in practice when we have such laws which enable the opposite? Thank you.
Well, there isn't a general rule that all of your communications can be intercepted. So there are rules for that when something can be intercepted or not. I mean, under data retention directive, although that's not really my area of expertise. So maybe you can add something to that. A lot of data is stored, but to use it, you have the proper authority as law enforcement officials to do something with it. So it's not like now that everything that you communicate is intercepted and looked at by people, because that's not the way it is. I am worried about these authorities becoming broader and broader, because more and more data is being stored, and the authority to use that data to do something with it is always extended more and more. So that's something to worry about. But there still are rules to deal with those issues.
Well, as far as legal interception is concerned, at least in the majority of democratic societies, you need a court warrant for that. So it's not that they can just install a bug in your phone and then they can just monitor everything you say or follow all your interactions on the internet. I'm not saying that this is something that we should not be afraid of or not, but in any case, we have to keep in mind that when the rules and the actors involved in legal interception work properly, then individuals are protected. As far as data retention is concerned, I think I have repeatedly been very clearly against the data retention directive, but I must say that the scope of application of the data retention directive is not as broad as people think. It is very broad. To me, it's a crazy piece of legislation, but I must say that for example, it does not allow the monitoring of your internet behavior. So this is a common misconception. People think that based on the data retention directive, somebody can just follow what you do on the internet. But this is definitely not the case. But okay, we are going beyond the scope of this panel, so we can take this offline if you want.
Actually, do you mind if I add something to that? Obviously, I can only speak to the U.S. the U.S. context. But I think that there is, I think we need to not maybe put quite as much faith in our law enforcement officials, perhaps, especially in the US, because the amount of requests that law enforcement gives to cell phone companies and ISPs is enormous compared to the amount of requests that they used to give for like physical wiretaps, because the amount of effort it takes to wiretap a physical phone versus just getting cell phone records from somewhere like AT&T it's so much less effort. So they're so much more likely to do it. And there's almost no transparency about where this information is being collected, how many records are being collected, whose records are being collected. We know that in the United States, warrants for social media use are almost always approved by the courts. There's very little pushback against them. And also, the amount of powers that the law enforcement can be granted when having access to social media is not just about gathering information. Often it's about using other people's accounts to impersonate friends. So if you're like up on a small marijuana charge, for example, the cops might make a plea bargain deal with you where they will take over your account and use it to lure other people into it, which is a totally new type of law enforcement that they never had the power to do before social networks. So even though it is beyond the scope of this panel, I think it is very much important for us to stop spending, not necessarily stop, but I think we need to spend more time looking at law enforcement and government use of data on social networks, not necessarily just marketing companies, because I think the risks from law enforcement and government are just as important. Well, thank you. Off my soapbox.
Any questions? Yes, Ralph?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ralph de Wolf. I'm also involved with the SPION project, and I have a question for Alice. So basically, thanks for clarifying that youngsters do care about their privacy and do not only use structural strategies. But my question is, do you think that a combination of these structural strategies together with these social strategies are enough in controlling your information flow? And also from a more technical point of view, how would you translate your results? You have more than 200 interviews, that's really fantastic, into new technologies that can really enhance youngsters in controlling their information flow?
Oh, that's a great question, thank you. My first answer would be that no, the structural and social strategies that teenagers are employing are not enough because their privacy is constantly violated in a wide variety of ways. But I don't necessarily think that the impetus should be on the teenagers to continue modifying their behavior. I think the impetus needs to be put on schools, parents, teachers, coaches, employers especially. There needs to be more regulation about what information that employers can collect off social media and what they can do with it. I think that what we're really finding is that teenagers are doing the best they can to work with a rapidly changing technical and social environment, and they do what makes sense to them within their peer group. I do not think that what makes sense for regulation or further sort of education is to continue trying to get kids to stop putting personal information online. That's just simply not going to work. Instead, I think it needs to be about where can that information go and who can it be used by. And I would like to see some of the social norms that are constantly being tried to be told to teenagers also extended to parents in giving your kids like a little bit more room and a little bit more privacy to experiment online and kind of do their wacky teen things. Your second question about technical solutions, I do not know the answer to that. It is very hard sometimes to translate this ethnographic material into any kind of plug-in or new social site like Diaspora or something like that. Because young people, they go where their friends are, right? They use what their friends are using. It's more likely, I think, that kids will continue sort of using this multiplexity of sites and going in all different places and using different sites for different things than it is that they would start using some sort of plug-in or new site for Facebook that would help them. So I mean, I'm absolutely open to collaboration or talking to anybody about these types of things, but for myself, I think it's difficult for me to envision what a technical mechanism would look like in response to this data.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, my name is Jaap Koopman from Radboud University Nijmegen, and I just wanted to make a comment because it was suggested that the fact that children use Facebook now and other social networks that will be the things that they will use in the future, and that will be the things that will be in the future. I mean, the fact that these things are used now should not stop us from thinking about how these things should be in the future, with the same convenience that they have now, but with much more safeguards. That's all.
You want a comment, or it was just a remark?
Well, maybe, I'm not no techie, so I don't know, but I like to socialize, and maybe we should bring technologies more in line with the ways humans socialize, and what kinds of requirements they have when they socialize. So you like to be more intimate with a certain person, but less with another, but you still want to be friends with that other person. And there are all kinds of, very subtle ways in the way we socialize, and somehow technology can't really get that right, because it's very subtle ways. So in a way we do things, but maybe we should try to get technology a bit more in line with those kinds of issues, and then it would be very important to tie in social science research with technology research, and maybe make things better there. Yeah. So it's maybe a bit of a vague answer, but I think that would be the general direction we should go in if we really want to do something that protects privacy online.
Yes, and that's also exactly one of the goals of the SPION project. So we hope in 2 years to be able to present you some more developments in that area. Time for 1 or 2 more questions, yes?
Yeah, Benjamin from a PhD student in computer science from KTH in Stockholm. I have a maybe more detailed question to Tammy. I really like this study, and I was wondering about this educational aspect that you said when trying to change the behavior of the young people. You had problems when they were taught about this in groups, and so in your second instance you removed some of the group work, I understood. So I was wondering, is this a general finding that it's difficult to do this because they feel caught in making a mistake or something publicly, or was that just a theory that you tested?
And what was, you say it was difficult with groups? No.
You had something in the second instance of your approach
okay.
to educate them. You removed this peer working or the peer education.
Because in our first intervention we thought, okay, one of the important instructional strategies is collaborative learning. But in this case, because social pressure and students, or youngsters, they really want to shape an online identity. They want to look cool. They want to post a lot of things. And so we thought about when you're in a class situation and they are discussing this, it's not easy for them to say, yes, but maybe this is not a good way. So we thought, okay, we will change that. And we will go for the more individual approach because the peer pressure will not be that strong. And indeed, it worked when you first got them to think individually about all the possible things. And then, okay, afterwards we still had a class discussion, but they had time to reflect on it on their own without having to say, okay, because one of the things they had to do is look at the profile and see what do you think of this information. Is this appropriate information? Is this maybe, and then they said, oh, who cares? Maybe my teacher sees it. Do you mind? Then of course they said, oh, no, not really. But if they could think about it individually, and then they had to write down something, and then it was a class discussion, then we noticed that it was, that it worked much better. So, and I think we did a lot of research in the past about collaborative learning, and collaborative learning was always the instructional strategy that worked best for all things, for constructing knowledge, for all other things. And now we were in this situation where we thought, okay, this might be not the right approach, and it seemed to be like that. So.
Okay, one final question.
I'm Andreas from the University of Leuven, and I probably have a naive question, so it's more towards the legal side again. So right now, if I want, I can go and I guess I can go buy online some wine, and I don't have to prove that I'm over 16 or 18, so I can drink alcohol. So do you think that after the new regulation, I will have to actually prove that I'm over 13 just to be able to convince them that I'm of legal age to consent to their privacy policy?
Well, there is probably already regulation in place where you do have to prove that you're over 18, but it's very hard to do that online because we don't have really, good ways of doing that in a sense that you can actually verify whether someone is over 18. But the way it's mostly done is that you have to pay by credit card, for instance, and people who have a credit card are mostly people, or always maybe people, because you probably have to prove that you're over 18 when you want to get a credit card. So if you have one, you can prove by paying by credit card that you're over 18. So they try to find other mechanisms for that, but this is not something regulated by the regulation.
Yeah, but what I may add there is that in cases that such as the one that you describe, actually there is usually a statement that you have to agree to that you are older than this age. Okay, there is no verification, then this is a problem that we already talked about, but you say, are you older than 18? Yes. If no, you cannot proceed with this. Buying this, yeah. So
my son of 9 is in Facebook 24.
No, but the actual also thinking behind this is, will this regulation push for or make even mandatory the use of government-issued IDs that people will be forced to use online all the time in order to prove that they're not children?
Well, that depends on what verifiable means, and we don't know really. Will it be enough to just tell the store that you're over 18 or that you're over 13 when it comes to Facebook? Or do we need more advanced mechanisms for that? We really don't know. We'll have to wait for the European Commission. They may set requirements in further, lower legislation that will deal with that, but we actually don't know what will be enough. That's a question still for us as well.
And it's also a difficult trade-off to make, because if you force population to use new technologies, then that may hurt electronic commerce and generally concluding transactions online. So there are many. It's a difficult trade-off. That was also more of a comment.
Okay, for any more questions, I would like to refer you to our panel members during the lunch break. I would now like to give Eleni the difficult task of formulating a very smart conclusion to our panel.
Now I cannot do it. Well, I can definitely not do that, but what I can do is I can tell you that I think the discussions were extremely interesting. We managed to approach the issue of protection of minors in social networks from various aspects. We had very interesting discussions during the panel discussion and the interaction with the audience on several issues. I think that as an outcome of the discussion of this panel, we can say that ethnographic studies and any kind of field studies is very important in order to understand the feeling of users with regard to privacy, in order to be able to feed this knowledge to technological developments and to technology in general, and how this can be translated into new features for social networks. It became clear that self-regulation is probably not the best way to go forward with regard to social networks and minors. It is important to keep in mind that research should not take paternalistic views, but we should be more open towards children. Education can play a very important role, although we haven't found the best way how to do it yet, and further research is needed in that. And last but not least, I should say that it is important to see that the legislator, both in the US and in the EU, they have realized that there is a special need of protection of children. They have identified the age of 13 as being the golden line, although we are not sure that this is the one that should be followed. It is interesting and important to see that it is the first time, at least in Europe, that such a distinction is being made. And I think this is the time and the moment where we should all join our voices, try to have a clearer view of how we want to see the protection of minors in social networks, and try to influence not only research but also legislation that will definitely guide us and limit also what we can do in the future.
I think that was a perfect conclusion. I would like to close this session by asking each of our panel members just very briefly in 1 or 2 sentences to identify what, according to them, are the most significant challenges in the future with regards to young media, privacy and social media. But really very, very brief. Alice.
I think that the challenge is protecting the use of information by young people, by employers, college admissions, and law enforcement. And I also think that balancing the desire for young people to express themselves and participate online with the desire of companies like Facebook to encourage them doing that so they can sell that information is another big challenge.
Thank you. Tammy?
Oh, for me, I think the big challenge is really to know what what the role is of the different actors, and also to come to a more balanced picture of it. Because now, okay, we are talking about a lot about all the legal things, but I think we should come to, like, all the actors should be involved, not only the legal actors, but also parents, the teachers, like the children themselves, and to come to a better view on that. For me, that's not really very balanced for the moment.
Okay, Simona?
Yeah, well, I've been talking about the big challenge with it, which is about how are you going to regulate these things in legislation. It's very hard, I think, because you have to know very well how the technology works. You have to understand children, and it's something that policymakers and regulators have to have to do. And I'm a bit skeptical that what we're designing at the moment will actually work, be it a regulation or self-regulation. But it's a very difficult task. I can see that as well. So that's a big challenge, I think.
Thank you. Elena, you want to add something? Or
No, I think I've said enough.
I think so too. I would like to thank all panel members for their involvement. I would like to thank you for your questions. If you want to talk to us, please talk to us during lunch, to which I would like to invite you all now. So have a good meal.